Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5. I hope you enjoyed last week when we talked about this issue of policy narratives. I want to talk about that a little bit as I go into this week's lecture. I also want to let you know that I think this week's lecture is going to be slightly shorter than the norm. I hope it is, um, because I want to describe our exercise, and I also want to talk about the website that I want you to use this week during the exercise, which is the Nebraska Legislature website. Um, just because I think it's important that you become familiar with that website in particular, but in general, um, websites that are hosted by, for example, legislative bodies, whether that's the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, state legislatures. In Nebraska, we have a unicameral one house legislature. Other states have the traditional House of Representatives and Senate, or some equivalent name. But this is where you're going to find the work of the legislature. And the work of the legislature consists not only of laws that are passed, but also bills that are introduced and never passed. So it's important for you to understand this from a policy analysis perspective. So let's move right into that. Okay, so the theme of this week is policy definition, or problem definition, really. Last week, we talked about policy narratives, and we used the example of American Social Security, the actual Social Security program, as as a way that people tell policy stories. So, to a lot of people, thinking about this idea of policy narratives seems kind of like a fringe idea because the idea of policy analysis is that you should go do a cost benefit analysis. We're going to talk about cost benefit analysis in a couple of weeks in the course, as a matter of fact, and some other tools that you should use often when doing policy analysis. And telling stories about policy just seems kind of loopy to a lot of people. But, the telling of stories really is in large part what makes us human, right? Um, if you go back to cave paintings, um, that you can find in parts of Europe uh, that are 30 or 40,000 years old. Those people are telling stories, right? They're telling stories about themselves and they're leaving a legacy for future generations. So, you know, in addition to finding rare treasures, if you've seen any of the Indiana Jones movies, where Indiana Jones goes out and basically robs tombs for treasures, um, archaeology, the science of archaeology, is really an attempt to discover the stories that ancients were trying to tell us, tell themselves, really, and to tell future generations. Um, for example, what was the purpose of the pyramids? Well, to bury some of the pharaohs. But why did they build uh, such large structures to bury one person? What are the stories behind that? Why would they do that? And so that is what the science of archaeology is, to a very great extent. It's trying to find the stories of the ancients and what it was they were trying to say. And without knowing it, we also tell stories all the time. For example, whenever you go to the website, the official website, say, of a nonprofit or a government organization, really what that organization is doing, if they're conscious of this, is they're delivering a message to you, the member of the public, that would be the citizen, or possibly the consumer, or possibly you as a potential donor, in the case of a nonprofit, for example. Um, and I say they're consciously delivering a message, but they may be unconsciously delivering a message. And if they're not thinking through it, then their strategic plan probably needs to be readdressed because, as you might learn about if you take a strategic planning class, part of that is consciously figuring out what it is your organization stands for. So, what do you think of, for example, when you hear the term Red Cross, a large nonprofit, very large international nonprofit? What does that connote to you? To some people, it's a story of great success, disaster relief, hospitals, blood systems. To some people, it's an example of sort of a close hold organization with not very good governance that does a sloppy job with overseeing its local chapters. Because both those stories have been out in the public, right? We use shorthand all the time to identify narratives when we talk about important ideas. So, what do you think of, when you hear the term North Korea? Do you think of this a story of a dynastic, communist regime that's been in power for 80 some years, and only exactly three rulers have been in charge of that country using brutality and military force to control the population? Or do you think of a story of a freedom fighter back in the 40s who was fighting against an equally repressive Japanese regime? Um, do you think of the war between North and South Korea? Do all those things come into your mind? And possibly a lot of them do, but kind of subconsciously. When you hear the term Ebenezer Scrooge, the main character of, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Scrooge has his name of that character has come to symbolize greed and avarice, right? Um, but Scrooge was a very successful uh, person of business. Um, he would identify himself as such in basically a free market system in England as it existed in the 1800s. What do you think of when you hear the term Declaration of Independence? Some people think of the term life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some people think of Thomas Jefferson and what his life might have been about personally and politically. So we use these shorthand titles for things, and they bring to mind a story of what those terms mean. So we subconsciously use these narratives all the time. So, um, what are some common policy areas for which we have narratives and often competing narratives? So let's think through a few of these. I list four, but you can think of, you know, tens or 20s or maybe hundreds more if you really sat down and thought about it. So, welfare. We have this story of a term that was actually used by lawmakers, the welfare queen, which actually tells a story of dependency, of a single mother um, who depends on government uh, welfare as a form of making a living. And in fact, that story denotes or connotes really, generational poverty and generational dependence on government versus another narrative, a competing narrative that really we're talking about a mother in need of what is called a hand up or a compassion towards our fellow human. How about national defense? National defense, you often hear the term the military industrial complex, which connotes this collusion basically between uh, defense leaders, civilian and military, with the defense industry, all with the goal in mind of simply propping up the defense industry and allowing it to make a lot of money, um, and to promote a stronger defense than we really need versus this kind of peace through strength narrative, which really originated with George Washington. We have, in order to promote peace in the world, we have to have a very strong military. How about fossil fuels? We can tell a story of transition from polluting energy sources like coal and oil to uh, renewable sources like wind and solar versus another narrative, which is we need to use these natural resources for America, for the betterment of America. These are a blessing, these natural resources, and we should use them accordingly. Um, National education standards, Common Core, for example. Are we talking about a story of improving national education outcomes for all of our students as they graduate from high school? Or are we talking about uh, uh, these things actually hurt in the maintenance of local control over schools, which is an American value. So, any kind of policy you can think of, you can find at least two competing narratives and probably a lot more stories about that policy um, that that are out there in the public square that do in fact compete with each other and they define how we think about the policy problem. So when we think about problem definition, this is going to relate directly to our policy briefs that we're doing in this class. So when you define the problem of your policy area, you need to make sure you know what you mean, and you need to make sure that the people who read the brief know what you mean. Because if you're not sure what you mean, it's for sure that they won't understand what you mean. But you have to be very clear about what you mean. So the question is really, and we're doing this in this week's exercise, that is, do policymakers or lawmakers, if you will, in legislative bodies, do they always understand the problem statement, and do they make their problem statements clear? Um, and for purposes of this class, the way we're doing our term project, which is our policy brief and the associated presentation, I'm using this step-by-step approach with the class because I want you to actually become more familiar with your policy problem and make it clearer as we go along. So I asked you to submit your proposals last week, and you all did that. And you know that for a lot of you, the feedback I gave you was narrow this. That's one bit of feedback, and the other bit of feedback was, define what you're talking about. And so our next step in this project is going to be um, the the problem definition. So it's necessary that we move from a broad policy area to a specific policy. It's necessary that you clearly understand what you're trying to analyze, and it's necessary that we look at this policy problem as something for which alternatives can be analyzed. That by that I mean, and I gave this feedback to some of you, I'm not wanting you to report on some policy area. This is not a research report on a broad policy area or even a narrow policy area. It's a policy for which you can create alternatives and then analyze those alternatives. And so the bottom line is that your problem definition has to be able to set up some means of measuring the outcomes or some means of comparing policy alternatives. You're not just talking about the policy. We're not just talking about Social Security. We're actually comparing alternatives to a policy problem about Social Security that we have set up. Okay, so how do you do that? And this week's reading, both the craft and the Bardak reading, um, help you to do that. So, and these are some highlights from the craft and Bardak readings. And by the way, very short readings this week, but they give you a lot to think about as you try to start defining policy problems. So first of all, you're thinking about causes, right? So in our example that we used when we talked about handheld cellular devices and operating a vehicle, right? So causes. Use of a handheld cellular device diverts a driver's attention when driving. And so when a driver is inattentive to road conditions, they can veer into other lanes or fail to slow or stop the car when required. So that's a problem, right? It causes accidents. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we have to come up with alternatives. And in our exercise in class, we did this. We came up with some alternatives like state laws should create an educational campaign to convince drivers to abstain from using their device while operating. A little stronger alternative that we came up with, that you came up with in our discussion, state laws should make it a primary offense. That means a law enforcement officer, if they see someone using their device while driving, it's a primary offense. They can ticket them. It's a fine that goes with it, just like speeding or failure to yield. Um, and then we talked about some federal solutions. For example, we said, well, the federal government should coerce states into doing that by withholding highway funds from states that fail to comply. Okay, so we came up with these kinds of alternatives, but now one of the things you want to think about as you're devising your problem statement is that you want to understand how you would measure each of the outcomes. Now, I will tell you that for your project, when you submit your problem statement, I'm not going to ask you to outline all the outcomes, but it's important to understand that your problem statement is going to lead to the creation of outcomes. And so this exercise this week is going to kind of help you think through that. So this week, and if you look on the discussion board and if you look on the readings tab, what I've asked you to do is look at, I think, about 6 different uh, bills from not this current session of the Nebraska Legislature, but the 104th Legislature. And I'm going to talk you through that website in a second here. But I want us looking at these 6 bills, and some actually became laws, not all of them, and I did that intentionally. Um, I want us to decipher some of the following questions. So, one, what was the introducing senator's policy intent? So, what did she or he intend to do with this policy? That leads to the second question. What was the problem and what were its causes? We just talked about that. So, why is this thing a problem according to this senator? Um, 3, you know, how was the problem going to be solved? In other words, so there's a problem and they know it and it has causes. So, okay, how are we going to solve the problem? That is what the bill purports to do, right? Okay, and then what were the outcomes of the policy purported to be? So, in other words, outcomes means if this senator succeeds in convincing the rest of the legislature to pass her bill and they pass it, okay, it has to have some outcomes. It has to change something um, among the populace, right? Um, for example, there's a problem. There's not enough money for public schools. So the problem or the solution is we're going to charge 1% more in state sales tax. So what are the outcomes? Well, the outcomes should be that schools will improve, right? And how would we prove that? Um, that leads to the fifth question. How are the outcomes going to be measured? So generally in that K-12 school example, if this senator says, let's increase the sales tax by 1%, it's going to net us X million dollars for the state budget, which we commit to public schools. Okay, how do we measure outcomes? Well, we might look at test scores, the standardized test scores of students in, for example, 4th, 8th, and 10th grade that they take. We might look at graduation rates from high school. We might look at any number of things, but the point is there should be some form of measurement, whether that's quantitative or more qualitative, but there should be something that in later years we can actually use to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy. Okay, so here's the website. I want to talk you through this in the next few slides. Um, and some of you are looking at Nebraska examples, some of you aren't, but this is the Nebraska Legislature website. So you can see right up there in the address, it just is nebraskalegislature.gov. It's all one word, and this is what pops up. So I'd encourage you actually to spend some time navigating this particular website. I'm just going to show you the things you need for this exercise, but you should navigate because there's a lot more information on this website than we're going to talk about in here. Um, so I'm going to navigate you through the part to get to the exercise, but do spend some time navigating it. So you see on here, it defaults to the 105th legislature, which we're in right now this year in 2017. But for this example, I'm going to have you use the previous session. I'll show you how to do that. So look over there on the left-hand side, and you see all these different tabs. I'm going to have you use the one that says Bills and Laws. So when you go to that tab, Bills and Laws, you're going to get a drop-down menu to the right of that with these 3 tabs, Introduction, Search Bills, and Search Laws. So I'm going to have you click on the one that says Search Bills. And then there's different ways you can search bills, and this will be useful actually for some of you looking for a particular topic. If you've scrolled on the page, it doesn't show on this screenshot, but if you scroll down the page, you can actually search bills by keywords. So if you wanted to search gun control, for example, you could search for that. But I'm going to have you search by bill because I know the bill numbers I want you to use. So LB 267 is one of them. So I typed in 267 there, and then to the right of that, there's another drop-down menu. The default for the drop-down menu is the current year, which is the 105th legislature, but I want you to use the 104th legislature. So you're going to drop down to the 104th legislature and put that in that box, and then click on the search tab to the search icon, I guess, to the right of that. And when you do that, you will get, here's LB 267. So a couple things to know about LB 267 here. I have a red box around the thing that says introduced copy. I want you to read that. And then additional info, I have the statement of intent and the fiscal note. I want you to read, click and read on all those things. Now, LB 267 was not passed. It was introduced, but then it never went anywhere. So when there's an introduced copy, that means it only got through one reading on the legislative floor. It probably went to committee and was discussed in committee, but that was it. So this bill didn't become a law. Okay, so here's an example of a bill that did become a law. This is LB 390, which is on your list. Okay, so how do you know it became a law? Well, for one thing, look on the text copies. You see introduced copy, final reading copy, and slip law copy. So what's the difference? The introduced copy is the copy that the senator introduced on the floor. The final reading copy, there are 3 readings of laws on the floor after it goes through the committee process. There's 3 altogether. The final reading copy is the one that was read and voted on by the legislature when it became a law. And then the slip law copy is actually kind of the draft law that is given to the lawyers to actually put into the Nebraska statutes. So that's really effectively the law itself. And then over to the right, you'll see, again, we have statement of intent, a committee statement, because this was heard in a committee and then passed by the committee back to the full legislature, and then a fiscal note. So I want you to read all those things. Okay, so what are we doing here with this exercise, this policy definition exercise? Okay, we talked about everything that is in paragraph 1 there. And again, I stress to you that I want you to navigate this website because it's useful to you to look at Nebraska policy and Nebraska law. And then down at the bottom, oh, actually, I should stop there. Paragraph 3, there's all the things I want you to look at. But down at the bottom, there's the 6 LBs, legislative bills, that I want you to look at. Some of them became laws, some of them didn't. I chose kind of a wide variety of different topic areas, from veterans benefits to refugee issues to gun control laws, the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid, higher education, medical marijuana, because I think these are interesting topics, but also because they're a wide range of sort of emotional topics that get talked about a lot in the public arena. So I want you to look at all of them. Even though the exercise itself, the discussion board exercise, you're only going to talk about 2 of them specifically. I want you to be familiar with all of them so you can comment to your peers. Okay, so here's what we're doing in the exercise this week. First of all, select 2 bills that you want to discuss in your first post. So for your first post by Tuesday night at midnight, I want you to do what I have at the bottom there. And then by Thursday, I'd like you to critique or question a peer. And please use somebody who used bills that you didn't use, for example. That's why it's important for you to read all of them. And then respond to that by Saturday, just like typical. So here's the things I want you to do, 1 through 4 at the bottom. I want you to state the policy problem the bill is addressing. I want you to state the cause of the problem. I want you to state the policy outcomes that the bill says it's going to achieve, and I want you to state how the achievement of these outcomes will be measured. And so this is partly just reading and partly it's interpretive. You might, for example, say, I don't think the senator did a very good job of explaining what he or she meant by this bill, and I think it's problematic. That's possible. And that might be a reason it didn't pass, because it was unclear. So I want you to think, okay, what is the problem statement once a policymaker is actually proposing a bill in a legislative body? That's really the purpose of this entire exercise. So that's it, really. Like I said, short lecture this week, really short readings, but I want you to spend some time with the Nebraska Legislature website and do this exercise. And as always, please contact me with your questions. Thank you.